The relationship has been very good, and that's what I need as Secretary of State. I wish Rex Tillerson well. Gina, by the way, who I know very well, who I've worked very closely, will be the first woman director of the CIA. She's an outstanding person who also I have gotten to know very well. So I've gotten to know a lot of people very well over the last year. And I'm really at a point where we're getting very close to having the cabinet and other things that I want. But I think Mike Pompeo will be a truly great Secretary of State. I have total confidence in him. And as far as Rex Tillerson is concerned, I very much appreciate his commitment and his service, and I wish him well. He's a good man.
Mr. President, what did you tell Rex Tillerson? What did you say to Rex Tillerson?
Rex and I have been talking about this for a long time. We got along actually quite well, but we disagreed on things. When you look at the Iran deal, I think it's terrible. I guess he thought it was okay. I wanted to either break it or do something, and he felt a little bit differently. So we were not really thinking the same. With Mike Pompeo, we have a very similar thought process. I think it's going to go very well. Rex is a very good man. I like Rex a lot. I really appreciate his commitment and his service. And I'll be speaking to Rex over a long period of time. I can't hear you. No, I really didn't discuss it very much with him, honestly. I made that decision by myself. Rex wasn't, as you know, in this country. I made the North Korea decision with consultation from many people, but I made that decision by myself. I actually got along well with Rex, but really it was a different mindset. It was a different thinking. What? Say it again. I respect his intellect. I respect the process that we've all gone through together. We have a very good relationship for whatever reason, chemistry, whatever it is. Why do people get along? I've always, right from the beginning, from day one, I've gotten along well with Mike Pompeo. And frankly, I get along well with Rex, too. And, you know, I wish Rex a lot of good things. I think he's going to do, I think he's going to be very happy. I think Rex will be much happier now. But I really appreciate his service. But with Mike, we've had a very good chemistry right from the beginning. Well, it sounds to me, I'm speaking to Theresa May today, it sounds to me like it would be Russia based on all of the evidence they have. I don't know if they've come to a conclusion, but she's calling me today. As you know, now we're going to the wall. We're going out to the wall. We're going to be looking at the prototypes, which is very important for our country. But Theresa May is going to be speaking to me today. It sounds to me like they believe it was Russia, and I would certainly take that finding as fact.
Mr. President, do you believe there should be a response from the United States? Do you believe there should be a response from the United States?
Yeah, as soon as we get the facts straight, and we're going to be speaking with the British today, we're speaking with Theresa May today, and as soon as we get the facts straight, if we agree with them, we will condemn Russia or whoever it may be. But I have not spoken to her. I'll speak to her sometime today. We're very happy with the decision by the House Intelligence Committee saying there was absolutely no collusion with respect to Russia. And it was a very powerful decision, a very strong decision. Backed up, I understand they're going to be releasing hundreds of pages of proof and evidence, but we are very, very happy with that decision. It was a powerful decision that left no doubt. So I want to thank the House Intelligence Committee and all of the people that voted so strongly. I'm looking at Larry Kudlow very strongly. I've known him a long time. We don't agree on everything, but in this case, I think that's good. I want to have a divergent opinion. We agree on most. He now has come around to believing in tariffs as also a negotiating point. You know, I'm renegotiating trade deals, and without tariffs, we wouldn't do nearly as well. But Larry has been a friend of mine for a long time. He backed me very early in the campaign. I think the earliest. I think he was one of my original backers. He's a very, very talented man, a good man. And I think Larry Kudlow has a good chance. I'm also speaking to many others, but I think Larry has a very good chance. Thank you all. I'll see you at the wall. I'll see you at the wall.
All right, so the President of the United States making some comments to members of the media there as he is on his way to Marine One, where he will head to California later today to visit the wall, as he reminded reporters. So we've got a roster of reporters and analysts to talk to us about this news coming out of Washington, actually coming out of Twitter, I should say. The President ousting the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. Our Jeff Pegues is standing by in Washington, D.C. Our Kylie Atwood, who's a State Department reporter, is also joining us on the phone periodically. And here in the studio, we have Alex Clement of G0 Media to talk about what this means for President Trump's meeting that is supposed to happen with the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. Before we get to you, Alex, Jeff, your thoughts on what you just heard from the President of the United States with regards to his respect of Mike Pompeo's intellect, clearly indicating, as you were earlier, that this is a loyalty issue. He sees eye to eye with the President of the United States.
Yeah, and that's one of Washington's well-known secrets, is that the two men are very close. They spent a lot of time together, and the president trusts Mike Pompeo. And you heard the president say it just minutes ago that, quote, we have a similar thought process, and that's how he described his relationship with Mike Pompeo. That said, what the president did not say there is the fact that Mike Pompeo has come out and condemned WikiLeaks for its involvement in the 2016 election and its ties to nation states like Russia. So in that sense, they've sort of been at odds in their thinking of how you handle Russia and its influence campaign during the 2016 election. Mike Pompeo has not held back on that issue, but perhaps he has a way of communicating his differences with the president that is different than what Tillerson had. So this is someone that the president trusts immensely. He is well schooled, Pompeo is, in the workings of Capitol Hill, having served in Congress, and he was a prominent member, by the way, of the Benghazi Committee. And so this is someone who, if there is a criticism within the CIA about him, it is that he can be overly political at times, and within the agency that is a big no-no. If you talk to some of the operatives there and some of the sources that we have there, they say this is an agency that tries to stay out of politics, above politics, but at times over the last year there was this feeling within the agency that Pompeo was overstepping that, and now with Gina Haspel stepping in, if the president gets his way and she is confirmed, that is not a problem that people within the agency expect to have, because they see her as certainly one of them. She has spent 30 years within the agency working her way up. She is a CIA officer, or was a CIA officer, so she is someone who is well respected. But in the White House, where it matters today, Mike Pompeo is someone that the president respects immensely.
So right before we went to the president's words, Kylie asked the question, we were talking about what did Rex Tillerson know ahead of this announcement, and Kylie asked the question, what did Mike Pompeo know? And it's pretty interesting. Margaret Brennan sent out an email sort of updating us on certain things, and she had actually briefly interviewed Pompeo and asked him whether or not he would meet with his North Korean counterpart, and I found his answer interesting in regards to what did he know ahead of time. And what he said was that he had been researching and reading into the histories of the CIA and its involvement in previous failed negotiations with North Korea, and that he would be sure to say that the U.S. will not make the same mistakes again, and that we will be at the center of providing the intelligence picture to the president and to the Secretary of State, which he is now. Alex, you're here, so now we're heading towards, and if all things stay on schedule in a couple of months, this historic meeting between these two world leaders, Kim Jong-un and President Trump. As we move in that direction, do things change a little with Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State?
Well, I think one of the big differences between Pompeo and Tillerson that you've already noted is that Pompeo has a much more hawkish view on North Korea and also on Iran than Tillerson did, right? Tillerson said the Iran nuclear deal is working pretty well. Pompeo agreed with Trump that it's the worst deal in history or a horrible deal and so on. And I think the views on the Iran deal actually complicate the negotiations with North Korea for one very important reason. If you're Kim Jong-un and you sit down across the table from Trump and Trump proposes a deal to you, and you say, look, the United States already agreed to a nuclear deal with Iran, which you are now trying to tear up or walk away from. What's the incentive for me as Kim Jong-un to believe any word you say? So I think the entry of Pompeo, look, I don't think Pompeo is going to be involved directly in the negotiations. Trump wants this for himself. But the influence around him, it's that much more hawkish influence. And I think the tie between what happened with the Iran deal and what could happen with North Korea is something to keep an eye on.
Right, that's interesting.
Kylie Atwood, our CBS News State Department reporter, is traveling with Rex Tillerson right now. He's just completing a tour of several African countries. Kylie, I'm interested. You just heard the president, if you were listening to our air, the president of the United States saying to members of the media that one of the reasons that he's appointing Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State is he respects his intellect. And I want to go back to Moron Gate. Right after the alleged remarks that the now ousted Secretary of State made about President Trump that he was a moron, the president suggested that if there was an IQ test, he knew the president was going to win that IQ test. And I wonder, just again, in going back and looking at this relationship that these two men have had, it's interesting as we've seen how bumpy it's been over the course of the year. But take us back to when the president first announced that Rex Tillerson was going to be Secretary of State. The president speaking much in the same way that he just did about Mike Pompeo, which was that he thought that Rex Tillerson, given his background as a CEO of one of the world's major corporations, was going to be able to bring a lot to the table. And clearly, what seems to have happened is Rex Tillerson brought a lot to the table the president just didn't agree with.
Yeah, and he also expected that Tillerson would be able to be someone that could pick up the baton on Russia and really, change what they're doing in terms of their negative influences around the world right now. And we haven't seen much anything change in terms of U.S.-Russia relations. Tillerson went there during the first few months. He visited with Putin and the foreign minister Lavrov in Russia. And he said at that point, it was early on in the administration, that the U.S.-Russia relations are at their lowest point since the Cold War. And Tillerson has actually maintained that those relations have stayed at the lowest point since the Cold War throughout the year. There hasn't been any necessary positive engagement there. And obviously, you have a White House that is kind of caught in some political debates over Trump's campaign and if he was colluding with the Russians. So you've got that situation domestically. But Tillerson hasn't been a person who's been able to kind of get on better footing in terms of U.S.-Russia relations. And I think that is a big part of what Trump expected he would be able to do. Trump also noted when he was talking to those reporters out there at the White House that Iran is a place where Tillerson haven't seen eye to eye. And Tillerson is someone who basically is seen as a primary person in preventing Trump from tearing up the Iran deal. We've seen months and months of Trump saying time and time again that Iran deal is bad, and Tillerson doing the legwork to try and see how they can make it better, how they can suffice the demands of Trump without actually tearing it up, which all of our European partners would be extremely frustrated by.
All right, Jackie, stand by. We want to go to, Kylie, stand by. We're going to go to Jackie Halimani, who's covering the White House for us and joins us now from Washington. All right, so Jackie, just take us all back. I mean, we've been reporting this for the last hour or so. The President of the United States has ousted Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. He is appointing Mike Pompeo, the now CIA director, to replace him. What more can you tell us about the President's decision decision-making. Clearly, Tillerson saying to Kylie Atwood and our Margaret Brennan that he had no idea that he was going to be ousted. He was intent on staying to get some of the difficult things that are ahead for this country and for the president done, and the president announcing that he was gone on Twitter.
Right. Like most things that happen in this White House, there are extreme contradictions at play here right now. But it's funny when you said for the last hour we've been reporting about Tillerson's ousting. For the past 5 months, since November 2017, we've been reporting that the president wanted to get rid of Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, that he wasn't happy with him. As a White House source told me at the time, the die was cast as soon as the moron stories came out, when Rex Tillerson called President Donald Trump a moron in a meeting with national security officials. And Trump felt from there on out that on top of the policy differences, the Secretary of State didn't have his back. We had reported at the time in November that Chief of Staff John Kelly wanted to get rid of Tillerson as well, had circulated a plan that was being circulated internally to replace Tillerson with Pompeo and potentially move, at the time I think we were reporting Senator Tom Cotton into the CIA position. So, the timing of this is surprising, but overall this isn't a surprise, right? But again, what is the impetus for Trump's very rash decision? As Kylie and Margaret reported, the State Department had no idea this was coming. But in the last week, we've seen two stark departures from the White House, between the State Department and the White House. And that's with North Korea. And that's also with, Rex coming out yesterday in Africa saying that, yes, Russia was behind the poisoning of a UK spy.
So we have some sound from over the weekend on Face the Nation. It's Rex Tillerson and Mike Pompeo, but the Rex Tillerson bit comes from a 60 Minutes interview. Let's take a listen.
We do have a plan for negotiations. We have an end state for that. It's a very stepwise process. We're not going to just leap from where we are today to denuclearization. We understand this is something that will have to be done through various steps to eventually achieve that final objective of denuclearization. And that'll come through a lot of negotiation, a lot of difficult talks. What we have to determine now is, are we even ready to start? Are they ready to start?
Tillerson said this will be done through him. Is that still the plan?
Look, this is a level of discussion the president's going to drive this effort, this negotiation. But it will take a team to build out the picture so that we put the president in the best position so that he can achieve that outcome.
Because it's unclear, though, if it's the State Department or your agency that will take the lead. It was your counterpart from South Korea who was at the White House this week.
I don't think there's any doubt about who's going to take the lead on this. The President of the United States is going to take the lead.
So the first meeting will be that presidential
The President
summit?
of the United States is going to take the lead in resolving this important conflict with North Korea.
But in terms of laying the groundwork, you can't send your president into that meeting without making sure that you give him the best tools possible. Will you take those first meetings? Will the secretary take those first meetings? How do you lay the groundwork for success?
Margaret, I'm not going to talk about how the negotiations will proceed on this Sunday show. Rest assured, when the president enters that room with Kim Jong-un, if Kim Jong-un lives up to the 4 commitments that he has made, those 4 major concessions, the president will be fully prepared for his conversation with Kim Jong-un.
Boy, oh boy, with a little more information now, that looks completely different than it did over the weekend. Jeff Vigues, now that we know that Rex Tillerson is out and Mike Pompeo is taking his place,